Today, Sunday, May 3, 2026, Vladimir Putin sat across a table from Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Library in St. Petersburg. He looked him in the eye, and he said, "We see how courageously and heroically the Iranian people are fighting for their independence and sovereignty." He said, "Russia will do everything that meets your interests and the interests of all peoples in the region to ensure that peace is achieved as quickly as possible." He sent his personal appreciation to Iran's supreme leader. He called Iran Russia's closest partner, and while he was saying all of that, Russia was making $19 billion in additional oil revenue this month alone from Iran's suffering. While Putin was speaking those words of solidarity, Russian oil tankers were sailing freely through the same waters where Iranian tankers are being seized by American Marines. While Putin told Araghchi Russia will do everything for your interests, Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov had already told the world Russia was ready to supply energy to countries affected by the crisis, meaning Russia was ready to replace Iran's oil in the market that Iran's own blockade created. Here is the sentence that every Iranian should hear. Russia publicly calls Iran its closest ally. Russia privately profits from Iran's destruction. Russia condemns the American blockade. Russia sends oil to fill the gap the blockade created. Russia signs friendship treaties with Iran. Russia watches without sending a single weapon as Iran gets bombed. What Putin just did to Iran is not complicated. It is the oldest move in geopolitics. He stabbed his closest ally in the back, smiled while doing it, and is now drinking champagne in the Kremlin. Tell me in the comments, do you think Iran knew this was coming? The friendship that was always a lie. Voice over. To understand the scale of what Putin just did, you need to understand what Russia promised Iran and what Russia actually delivered. In January 2025, Putin and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty. The two countries announced a new era of cooperation: military cooperation, economic cooperation, energy cooperation. Russian state media called it the most significant agreement between Russia and Iran in modern history. Iran supplied Russia with Shahed drones for use against Ukraine. Thousands of them. Iran's drones helped Russia kill Ukrainian civilians and destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure through 2 brutal winters. Iran gave Russia what it needed when Russia needed it most: cheap battlefield weapons at scale. In return, Russia promised Iran that it would be a partner, an ally, a counterweight to Western pressure. Russia sat on the UN Security Council and blocked every resolution that targeted Iran. Russia sold Iran air defense components. Russia trained Iranian military personnel. Putin and Iran's leadership spoke regularly. When Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28, Iran's leadership presumably expected that Russia would stand with it. Here is what Russia actually did. Russia kept its ships out of Hormuz. Russia kept its military completely out of the conflict. Russia made public statements condemning the American blockade, statements that cost Russia absolutely nothing because Russia has no ships being blocked. Russia's strategic partnership treaty with Iran specifically stopped short of a mutual defense pact. Newsweek confirmed it. Russia signed a friendship agreement that deliberately excluded the one clause Iran needed: mutual defense. Russia gave Iran words. Russia took from Iran billions of dollars in oil market share. That is not a partnership. That is a long con. Here is the precise financial picture of Russia's betrayal, because money never lies even when politicians do. Before this war started, Russia was in serious economic trouble. Oil and gas revenues had collapsed by 47% in the first 2 months of 2026. The Russian government was draining its reserves to fund the Ukraine war. The central bank kept interest rates at 15%, crushing Russian consumers. Kremlin officials privately warned Putin that a financial crisis could hit by summer. A Moscow business executive told the Washington Post the crisis could arrive in 3 or 4 months. Restaurants were closing. Workers were being laid off. Russia's budget deficit was widening. Russia was, in the words of one analyst, basically pawning the country to fund the war. Then on February 28, the United States bombed Iran. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, and 1/5 of the world's oil supply disappeared from the market overnight. Russian oil, which had been trading at a steep discount to global benchmarks because of sanctions, suddenly became valuable again. Urals crude nearly reached parity with global Brent for the first time since the war in Ukraine began. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air tracked what happened next. Russian oil export volumes in March were up 16%. Seaborne crude revenues were up 115%. Moscow's earnings from fossil fuel exports in March reached a 2-year high, 713 million euros per day, tax receipts of 7.4 billion euros for the month alone. Petros Katinas at the Kyiv School of Economics said directly, Russia is making a huge amount of money off the Iran war. Reuters calculated the Iran war would double Russia's main oil tax take in April to approximately $9 billion. While Iran bleeds, Russia counts money. That is what the friendship looks like in numbers. Before we go further, I need to hear from you. Russia is making billions from Iran's destruction while publicly calling Iran its closest partner. Is this the biggest betrayal in modern geopolitics? Or is this just how great powers behave, and Iran should have known? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because this debate gets to the heart of whether any alliance in the world actually means anything. Now let us talk about what Russia is doing with all that money. Here is the detail that should make every person watching this genuinely angry. Because the money Russia is making from Iran's destruction is not going into Russian hospitals, or Russian schools, or Russian infrastructure. It is going directly into the Russian military machine that is killing people in Ukraine. Before the Iran war, Russia's budget deficit was forcing cuts to state spending that Putin himself was trying to postpone because they would be politically unpopular. Sergei Vakulenko at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center told CNBC directly, what Putin was spending on the war meant he was basically pawning the country. Now he doesn't have to do that anymore. Russia's oil windfall is allowing Putin to keep funding the Ukraine war without making the domestic economic sacrifices that might have forced him to negotiate. The Kyiv School of Economics analyst said it plainly, it's definitely an early Christmas for Putin. We might end up funding Putin throughout the war. We, meaning the global oil market disruption caused by Iran's suffering, is preventing Ukraine from winning. Iran supplied Russia drones to kill Ukrainians. Iran's blockade is now funding Russia's ability to keep killing Ukrainians. Iran is inadvertently financing the war against the country whose drones it supplied, from both ends simultaneously. But Ukraine has noticed. And Ukraine has been doing something extraordinary in response. Something that is threatening to take away Russia's windfall before Putin can fully spend it. Ukraine has been bombing Russia's oil ports, specifically targeting the infrastructure Russia needs to export the oil it is selling at record prices. Because of Iran. Here is the extraordinary countermove that Ukraine has been making, and why it directly connects the Iran war to the Ukraine war in ways that Washington never intended. Ukraine has been systematically bombing the Russian oil ports and energy infrastructure that Putin is using to export the oil he is selling at record prices because of the Iran crisis. The Atlantic Council confirmed, Ukraine has focused drone attacks on Baltic Sea and Black Sea ports that Russia relies on to load oil for export. Research conducted by Reuters in late March indicated that Ukrainian attacks on port infrastructure had temporarily reduced Russia's oil export capacity by approximately 40%. 40%. Ukraine is trying to deny Putin the very windfall that Iran's suffering created. On April 20th, Ukraine struck Russia's Tuapse Black Sea oil export hub. Just 4 days after the previous Ukrainian bombardment of the same port, multiple repeat strikes carefully timed to undermine repair efforts and maximize cumulative damage. Ukraine's President Zelensky and his Chief of Staff Kyrylo Budanov both reported receiving requests from Western partners to scale back the strikes, because the attacks are impacting global energy markets and pushing oil prices even higher for Western consumers. Ukraine refused. Ukraine is saying, if Russia profits from Iran's suffering while supplying Russia with the drones that kill our people, then Russia does not get to keep that money. The drone that Ukraine is using to bomb Russia's oil ports is a more advanced version of the drone Iran gave Russia to bomb Ukraine. Iran's own weapon technology is now being used against Russia's ability to profit from Iran's collapse. Geopolitics does not get more circular than this. Here is the honest, complete picture, because Putin's champagne moment does not tell the whole story. Russia is profiting from Iran's crisis, but Russia is also revealing its own weakness through how it is profiting. Newsweek's analysis was direct. Russia is now a second-order power, shaped by events more than it shapes them. While Russia presents itself as an indispensable pole of a multipolar world, Pakistan brokered the Iran ceasefire without Russia. America is negotiating with Iran without Russia. China is the real power behind Iran's economy, not Russia. Russia was not needed at the diplomatic table even as its supposed closest ally faces an existential crisis. Russia's strategic partnership treaty with Iran was carefully written to provide no real protection. Russia's oil exports are being bombed by Ukraine with 40% capacity reduction. Russia's economy still has 15% interest rates and 5.9% inflation. Russia's public mood is darkening. The Washington Post confirmed today that Putin's ratings are falling, and Russian citizens are voicing despair as the Ukraine war enters its 5th year with talks stalled. The oil windfall is real, but it is temporary. Chatham House warned, if the Iran crisis leads to sustained lower global growth, similar to 2008, oil prices could ultimately collapse, and that would hit Russia catastrophically. Russia is drinking champagne from a glass it filled with Iran's blood, but the glass has a crack in it, and Ukraine is drilling that crack wider every time another Russian oil port burns. Here is the moment the betrayal became impossible to deny. Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov, at a diplomatic forum in Antalya, said these exact words. Russia is ready to supply energy to countries affected by the crisis. Countries affected by the crisis. Which countries are most affected by Iran's oil being off the market? China, India, Japan, South Korea. All of them desperately need oil that Iran used to supply. And Russia is volunteering to fill that gap. Russia is literally offering to sell its oil to the customers who used to buy Iran's oil, while telling Iran it stands with it in solidarity. I want to know in the comments, what do you call a friend who sells your customers while telling you they stand with you? Because Lavrov just showed the world exactly what Russia's friendship with Iran is worth. Keep watching, because what China is doing in this betrayal is even more shocking. Russia is not the only supposed friend of Iran that is profiting from its destruction. China is doing the same thing, just more quietly. China publicly calls for ceasefire. China publicly condemns the American blockade. China vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have encouraged nations to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. China voted against America's position. And simultaneously, China was buying Iranian oil at massive discounts throughout the war. China now holds Iran's largest source of energy revenue completely in its hands. Before the war, Iran was selling 90% of its oil exports to China at discounted prices because Western sanctions made China its only buyer. Now, with the US blockade in place, China is Iran's only lifeline. Iran needs China to keep buying its oil. China knows it, and the price China is extracting for that lifeline is total economic dependency. Iran cannot negotiate with America without considering what China thinks. Iran cannot end the war on terms China does not approve. Iran cannot make any strategic decision without Chinese financial leverage over the outcome. China supplied Iran a satellite to help aim missiles at American bases. China supplied missile fuel to keep Iran fighting. But China is also the reason Iran cannot freely make its own peace deal, because China needs the strait closed to keep American naval power focused on the Middle East rather than the Pacific. Iran thinks China is its partner. China is using Iran as a strategic tool to keep America distracted. Russia thinks it can profit from the chaos. Ukraine is trying to burn Russia's profits. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, Iran's people are paying the price while their supposed friends count their money. Here is the complete picture of what happened inside the Russia-Iran relationship over the past 8 weeks. Before the war, Russia was financially desperate. Oil revenues down 47%, budget deficit widening, Kremlin officials privately warning of financial crisis by summer. Russia needed Iran's suffering to survive. Then the war started, and Iran delivered Russia exactly what it needed, not intentionally, but perfectly. Iran closed Hormuz. Oil prices spiked. Russia's revenues doubled. Russia sold oil to Iran's former customers. Russia positioned itself to fill Iran's market share. Russia stayed entirely out of the military conflict. Russia signed a friendship treaty that specifically excluded mutual defense. Russia watched Iran get bombed without sending a single weapon. And today, Putin sat across from Iran's foreign minister in St. Petersburg, looked him in the eye, and said Russia will do everything for your interests, while collecting billions from the interests being destroyed. Lord Palmerston, Britain's 19th century Prime Minister, said something that every leader since has tried to pretend is not true. He said, "Nations have no permanent friends and no permanent allies. They only have permanent interests." Putin proved it this week more completely than any leader has in a generation. Iran had no permanent friend in Russia. Iran had a partner whose permanent interest happened to align with Iran's temporary usefulness. When Iran's usefulness changed, Russia's position changed with it. And the lesson for every country watching, especially the smaller nations that trust great power partnerships, is the most uncomfortable lesson in geopolitics. The great powers will always choose their interests over your survival. Before you go, I want your answer in the comments. Who betrayed Iran more? Russia, who profited from its suffering, or China, who used it as a strategic distraction? Drop your answer, because that debate is the real story of this war. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story is not about Iran and America. It is about what happens to Russia when the oil money runs out and Ukraine keeps bombing the ports.